Creepy Hermit Encounter. Submitted by Jordan. I live in Burlington, Ontario, a nice lakeside city near Toronto. This story happened to me during a school trip when I was in the 8th grade. At my elementary school, which by the way was Catholic, everyone in grade 8 would get to go on 2 trips as part of their final year at the school. One trip took place in the fall, and it was usually a religious camping trip that took place about 40 minutes out of the city. By religious, I mean everyone had to participate in group activities that revolved around being a good Christian and teamwork. This, of course, completely sucked at this camp. It was little more than a religion class stretched over 3 days. The second trip took place in the spring, and it was usually a trip to Ottawa for the weekend, where we could explore the city and visit museums. For some reason, it was decided my year would instead take another camping trip, about 4 hours away at Algonquin Provincial Park. The camp was on one of the many lakes in the park and was set up like your pretty typical summer camp. Cabins were spread out near the lake and partially in the forest, and there were bathrooms and a mess hall in separate buildings. As you would guess, boys and girls shared separate cabins. The girls' cabins were built on supports above the ground and were closer to the lake. Our cabins were almost in the forest and built on the ground along a gravel road. I shared a larger cabin with about 4 other guys. Although ours was the largest, it was probably the least comforting. While the other cabins had actual windows and doors that would fully close and lock, our cabin looked like it was built from balsa wood, only had thin bug screens for windows, and a door that wouldn't completely close. I should also point out that I had no experience with actual camping, as my family hated it, so this was a pretty bad first impression. This is where the creepy part of the story starts. On the first evening, we were all gathered outside the mess hall for a fun night activity. The camp counselors told us about a hermit that lived in the nearby woods. The activity was that they were going to take us into the dark woods in groups to see where the hermit lived. This kind of caught us by surprise as it was kind of random, but intriguing at the same time. As you would expect, everyone was pretty much screaming as we were led deeper into the woods with only our flashlights, looking for this hermit's house. When we finally came across the house, which was little more than a huge log with a makeshift bed, we were led back to camp. Although my group didn't see anything, other people started talking about seeing someone creeping around the dark woods. Someone in my cabin even said they saw blue glowing eyes in the forest. I shrugged it off, thinking the whole hermit story was made up by the camp to scare us, and the person in the woods was probably just a counselor. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to the sound of someone sprinting down the gravel road near our cabin. At first I was startled, and then a little creeped out, but then I thought it may have just been some animal. That wasn't until I started hearing the gravel crunch around our cabin. It was very soft, but definitely a person outside. I was suddenly terrified. My bed was right beside the door that didn't lock. An animal could have easily pushed the door open on its own and walked inside if they wanted to. There was also nothing covering the screens, so the person outside could clearly see in. I was ready to scream as loud as possible if someone entered the cabin. I had my eyes locked on the door, anticipating to see it slowly open, but it never did. The sound outside slowly disappeared into the woods. Immediately, I thought it must have been the hermit. I ruled out the possibility of it being a counselor or teacher, because it was at least 3 in the morning, which was a terrible time to check on the students. Surprisingly, I was able to fall back to sleep a short while later. That was the only interesting part of the camping trip, unfortunately. The rest of the trip was pretty dreadful. It rained non-stop for the remaining days, and a few people from my class caught the flu from another school that was sharing the camp with us, so the bus was partially quarantined on the way back home. As time passed, I mostly forgot about the creepy encounter, giving in to the possibility that it was just a counselor checking on us. The story doesn't end there, though. The following year, it was my younger sister's turn to go on the same 8th grade trip. Just like for my class, she also had to go on the weird Hermit expedition during the first night. Although she initially thought nothing of it, during one of the other days when she and a few friends went exploring in the woods along the lake, she described seeing a small hermit-like person sitting on a log in the distance. I know this isn't the scariest camping story to be told, but it creeps me out knowing that the hermit was indeed real, and that the camp thought it was fun or funny to lead a bunch of kids to this random person's house in the middle of the woods. It's also a delight to know that the hermit also isn't afraid to peek on unsuspecting campers in the dead of night. It's been almost 10 years since this happened, and I haven't done anything camping related since. My Experience in Algonquin National Park by Ike. I was taking a school trip with about half of my grade through the forests of Algonquin National Park. It's a huge provincial park where you're surrounded by water and trees and pretty much nothing else. The wildlife there flourished, and everything is secluded from our present society. In other words, there's no signal on your cell phone for the most part, no buildings, no nothing. We stayed there for a week with 2 guides and 6 other guys my age. The first day was great. We got to this camp that my school was hosting. I remember the lake water and trees and the beautiful cabins that we slept in for the night. Nothing too interesting happened that day. We got there and set up for the week. When we woke up, we headed down to the main lodge for breakfast and then set off for the water. On our second full day there, we were canoeing. I think we were doing it for about 5 or 6 hours. I didn't have a phone or watch with me, so I had to use the sun to guess. By the time we found a nice spot to sleep for the night, it was really dark. We set up our tents and got ready for dinner. On my way through the forest looking for twigs and branches for kindling, I spotted the most curious-looking animal. It stood like a person, but had the hide of a deer, and the head of it was like a wolf and deer mixed together. The moment I saw it, my body kicked into some primal fear mode. I stayed absolutely still, and my breathing went so quiet that I couldn't even feel or hear it. I was alone in the woods with this thing, my camp a few minutes away. I heard a snap of a twig, making me nearly jump. My head darted in that direction, and when I didn't see anything, I quickly turned back to this abomination before me, but it was gone. Quickly, I took the opportunity to run back. I was twigless when I came back, and my guides asked why I hadn't gathered anything. I quietly told them that I couldn't really find much good kindling, and that I wanted to help them start the fire instead. They looked at me funny but consented. About 2 days later, we were canoeing again. We did a portage and then canoed and portaged again, repeating the process until we came upon a mother moose and her baby drinking in the water. They were beautiful but intimidating. All of a sudden, I was overwhelmed with this feeling of terror. I was worried. I began to scan the forest around us, and I spotted the thing I'd seen before just 2 nights ago. I didn't know what it was, but just having it around me, it made me feel like my world was coming crashing down. My group started to shout at the moose to get them to move. We were in the water, so we should have been safe from any moose attacks. And luckily, the mother moose and baby got the idea. They turned and disappeared into the forest. By the time we reached the shore, the creature had disappeared as well, though I was left horrified at the idea of being in the woods again with that thing. That night, we were roasting marshmallows, the stereotypical camping trip snack. My throat got dry all of a sudden, so I went over to my tent to get some water. And a few minutes later, we went to bed. About 3 hours after that, I woke up, quickly regretting all the water I had drank. It must have been about 1 in the morning if I had to guess. I found myself a nice little spot to relieve myself. I didn't bring a flashlight, but it was okay because the moon was shining brightly in the sky. That was when, once again, the dreadful feeling came over me, as goosebumps sprouted all over my skin. Something about the dark had always freaked me out, but this was different. This was like my body knowing it wasn't alone anymore. It knew I was in danger. I felt this sudden urge to turn around, and soon I did. I saw the creature again, standing on 2 legs. It was closer than ever before, really giving me an idea of how big it was. Its eyes reflected yellow in the moonlight, and it was bony below its neck. And to be real with you, it looked like it had passed away a long time ago. It was more like a walking corpse than a living thing. I screamed, but all that came out was air, no sound. And then I ran back to my tent and hid under a blanket. Somehow I fell back asleep, because the next thing I knew, it was bright out, and we were getting ready to leave the area. Luckily for me, it was the last time I'd see that Wendigo again. Lac Wendigo. Submitted by Ava C. This is a scary experience we had in Algonquin Park in Canada, where we got stuck on a road called Lac Wendigo. My family and I were camping up north for some time, but sadly after 6 days we had to leave. We left early in the morning, around 8. I was with 3 people, my mother Cindy and my 2 cousins Cheryl and Samantha. As we were driving, my mother, being the outdoorsy type, wanted Cheryl to drive through her favorite place, Algonquin Provincial Park. It was simply gorgeous. I was 8 the last time we went, so I hadn't remembered much, and I was excited to go. I was too busy taking photos to realize Cheryl had turned down a road with the name Lac Wendigo. It was a very narrow, eerie road. We stopped a few times to have a snack and take some pictures. "I've got to turn around," Cheryl said as she looked for a wide spot to turn. The only problem was, there was nothing but a narrow path. She ended up having to unhook our trailer and back up until she could turn around. In the meantime, black flies and deer flies swarmed all over our car. It got so bad that we had to roll the windows up. Even then, all you could hear was tapping on the glass from the flies ramming into it. Cheryl was finally able to turn her car around, but she had to back up to get the trailer. Both Cheryl and Samantha were panicking. Their faces were both suddenly filled with dread. Everyone got out of the car in a hurry. They were suddenly trying to get the trailer back on the vehicle as fast as they possibly could, and I couldn't understand what the hurry was about. But in no time, they had the thing hooked back up, and then I heard Cheryl curse under her breath as she got back in. They made a point to lock the doors and check that the windows were all the way up. Then we sped out of there, and I swear, we were going so fast, I thought we'd lose control at any second. The whole time this was happening, a feeling of being watched was coming over me, and just as we were taking off, that feeling was at its strongest. So I couldn't hold back anymore. I turned around in my seat and looked out the back window, and behind me stood something that I'd never forget. There was a tall creature. It looked almost like a moose, but it was standing on its hind legs. It had these solid black eyes with an expression of anger on its face. It stared back at me with those beady black eyes, and I knew if we had stayed there any longer, we may have never left, at least not alive. I tried later to get an explanation from my family, but they never spoke a word, and ever since then, I've had nightmares about that thing. The Windigo of Algonquin Park, from Queen Bee. Location: Ontario, Canada. This is a story from my Popa. A couple of years ago, he and I were talking about going hiking in Algonquin Provincial Park, somewhere that he had been multiple times and had grown up near. Unfortunately, his health was failing and our trip was cancelled. He told me that it was likely for the best, since he wouldn't be able to protect me from the Wendigo if he saw it. My Popa is half First Nations, with his mother being Cree and Huron, and his father being Scottish. Because his mother was removed from her home as a child and placed into the schools, she lost her status as First Nations and wasn't allowed to live on the res, but she lived just outside of it, near Algonquin Provincial Park. Popa has many friends who lived on the res and would often go with him into the park to hike and hunt when he was a young man. They saw many strange things in the deepest parts of the forest. However, this is the story he shared with me that day. Popa was hiking with a friend named Ben when they were in their late 20s. They had already been out in the park for several days, camping at nightfall and continuing in the morning. They were rather deep in the woods. It was late October and getting colder as the days went on, but they were prepared for that and often camped in the middle of winter. One night, as the temperature dropped below freezing, they decided it was time to set up camp and start a fire. They were starting to gather wood when Popa heard something. It was the crying of a baby or child. Popa had grown up during the Great Depression and had heard stories of people abandoning unwanted babies and children in the forest. He started to follow the crying when Ben grabbed his arm. "Don't go over there, John. It's not what you think it is," Ben said, looking a little pale. "We should move our camp, or that thing will just keep wailing and getting closer." Popa was confused, not understanding what his friend meant. But what if that's someone in need? A kid or another camper who got lost? He broke free from his friend's hand. "I can't leave until I check it out." Ben sighed, but relented. He loaded his hunting rifle and told Popa to do the same before they went to check. The forest was in twilight now as they moved towards the crying. As they broke through a thick patch of trees, they came to an old campsite. There, lying on the ground, was a child that looked to be no older than a year. Popa started walking towards it, but Ben stopped him, telling him to wait. As Popa looked back, the child began to change. It stood up, the legs under it growing long and bent as if it had two sets of knees, each bending in a different direction. Its arms were much the same, with 2 elbows per arm, one bending forward, the other back. Its torso grew the size of a large man. Its ribs were protruding as if threatening to tear through the skin, and its head grew to the size of a man's, but with a mouth so large it took up most of its face. When its jaw unhinged, it began to cry again, as if it was trying to draw them closer to it. Ben began to chant, and the beast screamed as if in pain before running off, knowing that this was not going to be the easy meal it wanted. Popa was frozen to the spot. "What was that, Ben?" "That, John, was a Wendigo, the spirit of a person who became lost in the woods and starved. It is said that the spirit over time becomes twisted and evil. You must never approach one without protecting yourself first. Now let's go move the camp. This is its hunting grounds, and it will be back." Popa is in his late 80s now, and every time he tells this story, he still looks terrified. He's now palliative, meaning his days are numbered, and he asked me to take his ashes to Algonquin Park as he did with Ben's, and scatter them through the woods. But he reminded me never to go alone, lest I come face to face with the Wendigo. They let me go. from summer of 2019. I certainly don't want to be seen as crazy. Even I think that anyone who would tell an account like this would be nothing less than crazy. This happened last summer in Algonquin Park, Ontario, Canada. It's the reason why I'll never go back there. It was a long weekend. Me and my friends had planned weeks before to go up to a camping ground and have a good time. Me being 19 and the youngest of the group, never having camped before, I was a bit nervous, but I became more excited the closer the trip grew. I'd gone to a scout shop and caught a bunch of new camping gear, which I have long since given away. I'm not planning to go camping again after this. So we arrived on the Friday night and set up camp. I was learning from the more experienced campers in the group how to set up my tent and where. There were 6 of us, including me, and I felt relaxed sitting around the campfire the first night, laughing and telling funny stories about school and friends and family. As it got dark, 4 of the group members were tired from the long drive from the city, so they settled into their tents. I stayed up. I was filled with excitement from experiencing my first camping trip. 2 of the others in the group stayed up too, Sarah and Jonathan. They were kind of flirty with each other, but I didn't mind. The campground wasn't very full, which struck me as odd. It was a long summer weekend, and the night was overcast. Looking into the woods, it was pitch black out there. It was rather chilly, and we were low on firewood, so Jonathan proposed that he and I go out and collect some. I was a bit nervous, but I agreed. We left Sarah by the fire, then headed out into the woods with my brand new flashlight. He was using his phone light. Not wanting to go too far, I found a dead fallen tree, so I started to break off arm-length branches. I had to put down the flashlight at one point, so I could snap the tree limbs with both arms. I soon stopped when I heard a crunching in the woods maybe 30 feet in front of me. Thinking that Jonathan was trying to go around and give me a newbie scare, I dropped my pile of firewood and hid behind the dead tree. I turned off the light so I could give him a taste of his own medicine. I heard the crunching growing closer, but a second later in the opposite direction I heard Jonathan calling out to me, back the way I'd come from. So, it wasn't Jonathan. Scared, I stayed silent from the noise of the large footsteps. They were still coming towards me. Then a musky, gross smell hit me. I held my breath and slowly turned, blood roaring in my ears. I looked out over the dead tree from my seated position, and I saw a large, dark shape looking like it was covered in patches of fur and standing on 2 legs. In a second, I was up on my feet, running back to the campsite, not caring that I had dropped my flashlight in my haste. When I was back in camp, I was slightly shaken. Sarah and Jonathan looked at me confused and asked what was wrong. I described what I heard and saw, and Jonathan just laughed it off, saying that I was spooked by a bear looking for food around the camp. They made a joke about me becoming its dinner, but Sarah said it was probably more scared of me than I was of it. I highly doubt that. Not impressed and feeling a bit more relaxed after the explanation, I went into my single man's tent for the night. All I wanted to do was sleep, coming down from my adrenaline rush. The next morning, I went back, looking for where I left my flashlight, but I couldn't find it. I was disappointed. I spent a lot of money on that thing, but crap happens, I guess. That day we spent cooking around the fire, playing games like soccer and going on hikes. I opted not to go on any hikes and volunteered to watch the camp. I was a little nervous about what was out there, and all my friends agreed. We needed someone to look after the camp after all. While Canadians are nice, not all of them are, and petty theft happens at campsites all the time. So they left on their walk around 1 p.m. I estimated that they'd be back around 3 or 4. I sat at the fire reading a novel I'd brought just in case I got bored. Soon the fire was low again. By then it was 3 p.m. I decided I'd rather go out and get firewood while it was still light out. not wanting to risk running into that large thing again. I set my book aside, and I went into the woods the opposite way I went the previous night. By about 40 feet into the woods, I'd managed to get a good pile in my arms, when I was hit with that smell again. I quickly turned to head back, but I froze, dropping the pile of twigs and branches in my arms. There it was, the creature from the night prior, sitting up in a maple tree about 15 feet from the ground looking down at me. It looked like a large wolf, sick and wrong and skeletal, with a large scar on its left shoulder. Its eyes were yellow, with the dark parts trained on me. It realized I was looking at it. It looked like it started to smile. It was showing its yellow, sharp teeth. Then it jumped to the ground, landing with a heavy thud. When they say you get frozen in fear, I knew then what that felt like. I couldn't move. Primal fear took hold. The thing tilted its head at me and took a step forward, then another. That's when I noticed it was holding something in its skeletal wolf-human hand. It was my flashlight from last night. It seemed to smile wider, as if it stopped 10 feet from me and held out the flashlight to me, almost like it wanted me to take it. Then it slowly crushed it, the plastic and glass cracking ominously in the woods. It dropped what was left at its feet. I shook, tremors coursing down my spine. I heard more rustling in the trees around me, and then the whispers. Whispers that came close and grew loud. With us, come with us, come with us. But then there were other whispers mixed in. Leave. You don't belong here. Go away. Some beckoned me. Others warned me to get away. It was all garbled together, and out of the corner of my eyes I saw dark shapes around me. My eyes were glued to the large one in front of me, though. That's when I blacked out. I don't remember anything after that. Not until I woke up. When I came to, it was dark, and I was beside the campfire. My friends were prodding me gently. They asked if I was okay, and if I needed to go to the hospital. My eyes felt heavy, and I was confused. I looked up to see 5 very concerned friends. They informed me that when they got back, I was gone. They looked around and found me in the tree line, just by the campsite. My head was covered in dried blood. They asked if I remembered falling, and if I did, how hard. They asked if I was attacked, too. I slowly sat up and felt the back of my head. It hurt like mad, and it was matted with dry blood like they said. I looked at my friends, confused. I wasn't just in the tree line, I was a bit away from the tree line. And those things... Cold rushed through my veins. I don't know why, but all I said was that I tripped and hit my head while going to look for firewood, and that I felt horrible. I wanted to leave. My friends nodded their heads, said they were already starting to pack up so they could take me to the hospital. They finished loading up the cars and truck. We left soon after, and I kept my eyes closed the whole ride back. I was too scared to see anything out the window for as long as we were still within the woodland areas. I didn't want to see those eyes staring back into mine. I'll never go camping again. I've learned my lesson that there are far worse things than mosquitoes and bears in Canada's woods. I feel like some of those creatures didn't want to do me harm, but others did, and I have no idea why they let me go. Who knows for sure? I'll never find out. In fact, I don't think I'll ever feel the need to even want to find out. That brings us to the end of this episode of Darkness Prevails. More terrifying stories are on the way soon, so subscribe and smash that like button. By the way, did you know this show is available as a podcast called Unexplained Encounters? Just search for, follow, and rate Unexplained Encounters on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast app. This show is part of the EerieCast network. Go to EerieCast.com for more scary podcasts, such as Freaky Folklore, which explores your favorite monsters, myths, and mysteries, as well as Redwood Bureau, a fictional horror podcast about an agent on the run from an evil secret organization that captures supernatural creatures and entities. Well, thanks for tuning in. Stay safe out there and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one.